Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ask robtrek, where I try to answer your questions from the comment sections of my videos. And if you have any questions, feel free to leave them down in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer them. And for everyone watching, if you find these videos helpful, consider buying me a coffee or making a small donation in the links below, because they help me to continue making videos like this, and they're greatly appreciated. So with that said, let's get started. All right, today's question is from Kent Jakusz, and this is actually a follow-up because I tried to answer this question in a previous video, but he gave me some more specifics here. He says, I'm using the OM1 with either the Godox V860 or the Nissin i60A, which I think is the same thing as the Godox, but in any case, the lens is an Olympus 40-150 f2.8 high-speed sync is on, and he gets the same results with both flashes. In manual mode with flash on, auto ISO, the ISO value does not change from 200 no matter what the exposure. And the exposure meter shows the exposure, but the ISO is not adjusted. Works fine with no flash. And then there's a second question here. It says, also, I do not understand the relationship between flash exposure compensation and camera exposure compensation. It says, I want to use the flash as a fill for bird and pet photography. As this is my first Olympus camera, I find the menu confusing. Please include proper camera and flash menu settings for this application. All right, so basically you want to be able to use auto ISO with your flash. And let me eliminate some of the variables here. It really doesn't matter what lens you're using. It really doesn't matter what mode you're in. You can be an aperture priority, shutter priority, manual, it doesn't matter. And also it really doesn't matter if you're in high-speed sync or not. The key variable here that you need to control is the flash has to be in TTL mode. Alright, so when I answered the question last time, I put my FLM3 flash on the OM1, and this is the little tiny flash that comes with the camera, and tested in TTL. The auto ISO was working fine, and put it in the manual mode, and auto ISO was fixed at 200. And everything I said there and what I've said up to this point still holds true when you're using this flash. And I'm going to have to assume it's going to work just as well on other Olympus branded flashes. However, this time you told me you're using a Godox V860 and a Nissin i60, and I happen to have a Godox V1, which is functionally the same as your Godox V860. So basically what I found was when I used the Godox flash in TTL mode, the auto ISO did not function as expected. So basically this is the second incompatibility I found when using Godox flashes with the Olympus camera. The first one being is you can't use the Godox flashes with the in-camera focus stacking. Bracketing works fine, but if you're trying to stack in camera, when you're using a Godox flash, it's not going to work. Now this is a problem I haven't personally really run into before, because when I use flash, I typically put the camera into full manual and I use the flash in full manual, and then I control the lighting and the exposure and everything. And the few times I've used TTL, the exposures have been fine. There was the random exposure that was kind of way off, but that's kind of par for the course when you're using TTL. You're going to get an exposure that's not quite what you expected when you let the camera do everything. Alright, so I'm going to give you a quick demo of the issue, and then I'm going to show you how the camera should behave when you have a 100% compatible flash on it. Alright, so taking a quick look at the control panel, you can see I'm at the max sync speed, f2.8, and auto ISO, and we'll talk about the exposure comp here in a minute. But if we just take a picture here, you can see we're at ISO 200, f1.8, so nothing has changed, right? And if I crank up the aperture, say to f5.6, take another picture, you can see again, still nothing's changed. And the exposure is pretty much the same, because all the camera has done is increase the light output of the flash. But if I crank the aperture up even higher, I'm going to reach a point to where the flash can't output any more light. So if I take a picture here, you can see now that the exposure has gotten darker compared to the previous one, because now the camera can no longer the flash can no longer put out enough light to give you the proper exposure. And if I go even higher, you can see that we're at f16, the exposure is darker, but the camera did try to raise the ISO to 320 to compensate for the low light. but it's just not enough. And, you know, extending this out to f22, you can see it raised the ISO again to 500, but again, it's still not enough. Now I'm going to turn on high-speed sync. So now I can raise the shutter speed to, let's say, 1/1000th. Let's go back to f5.6 and take a picture here. And you can see it's just way too dark. All right, so let me swap out and let's just put the FLM3 on here. And I'm going to point it up like this. And let's take a couple of pictures and you'll see the difference. All right, now this flash is not high-speed sync compatible. So the shutter speed's back down to 1/250th. And we're at f5.6 with auto ISO. And let's take a picture here. And as you can see, it raised ISO to 640 automatically to give us the proper exposure. Let's go ahead and go up to let's just go right to f11, take a picture here. And now the ISO is at 1600. It looks a little darker than the previous one, but it is trying, right? And then if I go, let's go all the way to f22 and take a picture here. You can see it raised the ISO to 12,800 to give us the proper exposure. And that's how it's supposed to work. But what I recommend really is you need to learn how to use flash in full manual mode and not rely on TTL or auto ISO because you're going to get inconsistent results. And really, it doesn't matter what brand of camera it is or flash that I've ever used. You know, whenever I relied on the camera to meter the scene and set the exposure, shot to shot to shot, has never been 100% consistent. All right, now to address your question about the difference between flash exposure compensation and camera exposure compensation. All right, so camera exposure compensation is exactly the same with or without flash. The only difference being is that it can now adjust the output power of the flash to give the exposure that you want. So if you dial in a -1 exposure comp, it's going to adjust the shutter speed, aperture, ISO, and or flash output power to give you that -1. And if you dial in +1, again, it's going to make those adjustments to whatever settings it needs to give you the exposure that you want. Now, flash exposure compensation works a little bit differently. Let's say, for example, you dial in a -1 flash exposure compensation. What the camera is going to do, it's going to meter the scene and get all the exposure data it needs for shutter speed, aperture, ISO, and also flash output power. But before it takes the picture, it's going to reduce only the flash output power by 1 stop when it takes the picture. And that may or may not reduce the exposure of the scene by 1 stop. Because a lot of things come into play for exposure, right? You could be outdoors in bright ambient light. You could be indoors in a studio with artificial lighting. You could have multiple flashes set up. So changing the output power of the flash alone does not necessarily change the exposure of the scene overall. Now, if the flash is your only source of light, then dialing in -1 exposure comp on the flash is effectively the same thing as dialing -1 exposure comp on the camera because it's the only source of light. But that's not usually the case, right? You're not shooting in pitch black where flash is the only source of light. All right, so what I'm going to do to demonstrate this is let me adjust the ISO so that I have the ambient light giving us roughly a normal exposure without flash. So if I turn the flash off, like so, if I take a picture, I'm going to get a normal exposure. Now, if I turn the flash on, I'm not going to see much difference because there's really enough light in the scene already. So all the flash did at this point is really act like a fill-in. If I go to the previous image, you can see the exposure overall is pretty much the same. The only difference is when I show you the image with the flash, all it did was kind of fill in some of the shadows. Because again, I have enough ambient light. But if I dial in exposure compensation on the flash, let's just dial in +2. Let's see what happens. You can see that the flash output power is much brighter now. Even though, if we look at the settings, you can still see I'm at 1/200th of a second, f1.8, ISO 1250, as versus the previous image, I have the same exact settings, right? 1/200th, f1.8. So I haven't changed the ambient light at all. All I did was change the output power of the flash. Now if I dial in -2, guess what's going to happen? I can predict that the image is going to look pretty much the same as the normal exposure. The only difference being is that we're not going to have quite as much fill-in light, right? So there, I take the picture, and as you can see, there's a little bit of fill-in light there, but the overall exposure is exactly the same, right? And even if I dial in -3, can I go any higher? No, -3 is it. I take another picture. You can see it's just not that much difference, because the ambient light in the room is providing enough light overall, and the flash is just giving us a little bit of fill-in. So as you can see, dialing an exposure comp on the flash may or may not make a difference on the overall exposure of the scene, because again, it's going to depend on ambient light, additional flashes you might have, etc. Now contrast that with doing exposure compensation for the camera overall. To do that, I actually have to put this back into auto ISO. And then let's dial in -2 and take a picture. And you'll notice the flash is still at 0. You can see that the overall image is 2 stops darker, as opposed to the previous image where we actually dialed in a -3 flash exposure compensation. If I click here, you can see that far right, -3 flash exposure comp didn't make any difference. Alright, so I hope that made sense. And as for your last question about settings for flash as a fill for bird and pet photography, unfortunately there's not really like any best settings or anything when it comes to flash photography. You have to understand the relationship between the shutter speed, aperture, ISO, the flash output power, what is the ambient light in the room, are you using multiple flashes, are you using flash modifiers, distance to the subject, you have the inverse square law. So the best thing to do really is to practice. Put your camera into manual mode, lock your shutter speed at 1/250th, your aperture at f1.8, and your ISO at 200. Then put your flash into manual mode and just the flash power until you get to the lighting that you want in your scene. And that's the best way to start practicing with one light. And there's a lot of tutorials online for single light type flash photography. So check those out. If you guys are interested, maybe I can do one. I mean, I have a few videos on flash, but they're not really full-on tutorials, right? They're just kind of like, see what I can do kind of stuff. But in any case, that's all I have time for today. Thank you so much for your questions. And if anyone has any more questions, feel free to leave them down in the comments below. And if you find these videos helpful, consider buying me a coffee or making a small donation in the links below, because they are greatly appreciated. And again, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.